button.
First, I had to accept the recording. There's a screen where I can give some highlights about my background and so forth, but no, you've pretty much covered it. Shall I begin? Okay. So, here we go. We're going to talk about Scrum at Scale. I'm going to introduce a couple of concepts, and then we'll do the case study. And of course, it's not letting me advance. There we go. So that's a little bit on me. I've been doing this for a while. I first started playing around with Scrum in 1997. A couple of 3 years after, let's see, I think it was Ken who presented it down in Texas. Those are the companies I've worked for. Some of them I've led the transformation, and I've done various jobs over the years and so forth, and in different countries. And now I'm with Fidelity, and that's how I came to know Joanna. And in fact, if you guys want, I can give you a PDF of this deck with content. And there's some articles. If you just these are some things that ended up, I think they're all on LinkedIn. Some of them were on different sites, but I'm not going to go through that now. But anyway, so that's me. And I always show this slide I think this is a well-heeled group when it comes to Agile and Scrum and Kanban. But here are just some pictures of what this looks like in the wild when I've done this at various companies. Sometimes hamming it up, sometimes not. But today, we're here to talk about Scrum at Scale. So as Joanna mentioned, I worked with Jeff Sutherland for a while. Actually, I've hired him in the past and he hired me. I worked for Scrum Inc. with Jeff for, I don't know, a couple of years, 3 years, whatever it was, with, the whole crew over there, JJ and Patrick and Avi and so forth. Some of the content from these slides come from Scrum Inc. Although for whatever reason, I couldn't get the master slide to show the footnotes. So what I'm going to take you through is the Scrum at Scale as described in the Scrum at Scale guide, which when I was there, obviously, contributed to and so forth. It'll be quick. I'm not going to bore you with it because I just want to give you enough so when we talk about the case study, you'll understand how we leverage this. So first, let's talk about the general framework. There are two cycles, they're known, the product owner cycle and the Scrum Master cycle. And where they intersect is what we know as team level Scrum or feature team Scrum. So this is where we have the daily Scrum, the refinement, the review, etc. And at the end of each sprint, we have a potentially shippable increment of product. So I've highlighted that in blue. And it's often the case when we talk about Scrum, while the Scrum team is in the Scrum and they've committed to a sprint backlog, and we all know that's not supposed to change once they make the commitment, there's a whole lot of stuff that's going on outside of the team level Scrum in the organization. And so we're going to take a look at the mechanisms for that. But you can see in the circles, hopefully you can see my mouse, we need to know what the clearly articulated vision is for the product or portfolio of products. We need to somehow get those down into backlogs, that and high-level backlogs, which needs to be decomposed and refined with some sort of targeting for release planning, which then helps feed the backlog for the Scrum team. And then during the sprint, the operational aspects, we have, Scrum Masters are helping or causing impediments to be removed. There's cross-team coordination, and when we learn about the scrums with the scaled daily Scrum and so forth, it's actually the release mechanism. So this is the stuff in blue, that's just the regular team level Scrum. So first, let's talk about the challenges. I always note this because I've seen so many examples. It's never a good idea to scale bad Scrum or whatever. So you want to be following the Scrum guide. It's not like I've actually had this question over the years at more than one company. Steve, how often should we do the daily Scrum? Maybe daily, right? And so forth. So we want to do good Scrum, and we want to descale is what it's called. And the recommendation is you should at least have a 200% increase for the Scrum team to know that you're actually doing Scrum, you're removing impediments, you're getting into the groove before you say, okay, we have a hang of this, let's scale it across the organization. And then the scaling challenges is overcoming bureaucracy. So we have minimal viable product or minimal viable increment. And so Scrum at Scale is about minimal viable bureaucracy. I'm not going to take into a lot of the details, but we do want emergent practices and designs, and we want it to be based on things becoming only as complex as they need to, which is complex adaptive systems theory. And so on the Scrum Master side, we'll have the executive action team as sort of that organizational level guidance. We'll have the executive meta Scrum, which is the mechanism that takes really big ideas, a product, a program, an initiative, and starts to break it down into a shared backlog for Scrum teams to work on. And then we'll talk about the Scrum of Scrums, which is a collection of Scrum teams that have been organized to work on a single value stream. And if you're familiar with Spotify, this would be known as a tribe, perhaps. Other organizations call it by other names. But it's really a collection of Scrum teams that are sharing a backlog. So I always show this. This is a good book. Stanley McChrystal wrote this book. And this book, Team of Teams, is how the Central Command, United States military, CENTCOM, is the part of the military that worries about the Middle East. And this is how they refactored military operations to go from a typical command and control. They went through, central decision making. They went through a phase of, which is a command of teams, and then essentially a cross-functional set of different functions in the military. So this could be intelligence, this could be operational military units, could be planners, could be the FBI, it could be whatever it is, and how this was distributed decision-making or distributed management. So that's an interesting book. And the thing about this slide, is that the structure you come up with, Conway's law is what this is known as. The structure you come up with is in fact the strategy of your organization. It's often based or constrained, if you want to use that word, to the communication pathways within the organization. So depending on how fervent you believe in Conway's law or not, the notion here is the service, the product that you deliver tends to be reflective of the org chart. And so the service is delivered by this, which was fighting Al-Qaeda, actually. They had to adapt military command structures for that. So it's a good book. Team of Teams is sort of a Scrum of Scrums. So let's look at the Scrum Master cycle. And so we'll start at the team perspective, and then we'll see how this scales, or the Scrum Master accountability scale through cross-team coordination, continuous improvement, removal of impediments, and actually acting as a release team. Okay, so we all know about this. Scrum teams, they have a Scrum Master, they have a product owner, and we still use that phrasing even with the 2020 Scrum Guide, where these are accountabilities. But the Scrum Master protects the team, servant leader, coaches people on how to do the best possible Scrum, helps facilitate ceremonies, helps to remove impediments, but more often than not, just make sure that impediments get removed by the right people who can remove them, etc. And so, here we could talk about ideal sizes of Scrum teams. Scrum Guide says 10 or fewer. I have another case study where there was one team with, I can't remember now if it was 14 or 15. It was a collection of Scrum teams. Only one of them was 10 or fewer. And we still managed to deliver a year and a half early. So the idea here is what works, works. Smaller is better, smaller is faster. The Scrum Master kind of protects the team and helps the team do the best possible Scrum. So when you when you have a bunch of Scrum teams working together, how do the Scrum Masters work together? one of the interesting things here is an individual Scrum team that's self-contained, said to have an independent path to production, can release. They can just release. Well, if you're sharing a backlog and you're working with other Scrum teams, how do you deal with that? How do you release? How do you coordinate? So in this example, 5, and I'm using these diagrams because this is what was put forth in the Scrum at Scale guide. So I'm using some of the Scrum Inc materials here. We have a collection of 5 Scrum teams, and let's presuppose every Scrum team has 5 people on it. So you have 25 people here. Now, if we were to get 25 people together in a room and have a confab to discuss what's going on, what challenges are we facing, and how are we going to release our way cool product, this would take a long time. There's an interesting equation for this. N times n minus 1 divided by 2 will tell you how many communication pathways there are in a group of people. So 25 times 24 divided by 2 is a whole lot of talking. And so the Scale Daily Scrum, which is the event for the Scrum Master of the Scrum of Scrums, I'm going to have to chart this out, is the mechanism that is the daily Scrum, only it's now a virtual team of representation from each of the 5 Scrum teams. And so what do? They surface and remove impediments. They're basically doing the daily Scrum. It limits communication pathways. It achieves what's known as communication saturation, so everybody has situational awareness. And there's cross-team coordination. And this is the team that actually releases product. So it's basically the daily Scrum, only now you have a Scrum Master, let's say, or a representative of each Scrum team. So 5 of them come together and create a virtual Scrum team to do all the stuff that a Scrum Master would normally do for an individual Scrum team. All right, so what does this look like if we have something that requires 20 or 30 Scrum teams to work on? Well, it kind of looks like this. It's fractal. Fractal. If you're a object-oriented programmer, you could say we're just instantiating an object, whatever works for you. But the idea is this is supposed to be fractal or linear. So now you have 5 collections of 5 teams, and instead of calling that a Scrum of Scrums, we call that a Scrum of Scrums. Partly the reason for that choice is because we did not want to introduce additional labels into Scrum. And so now here you have the Scale Daily Scrum, and you notice the text didn't change. So now I'm gonna move my mouse on the screen here. So here are 5 Scrum teams. They do their daily Scrum for 15 minutes or so. Right after that, they do the Scale Daily Scrum for this Scrum of Scrums. All of this is happening at the same time. 15 minutes later, there's a Scale Daily Scrum facilitated by a Scrum Master for the 5 representatives in the Scrum of Scrums. And we can go on ad infinitum. And this is when it starts getting really big. So we have the executive action team. This is as good as the humor got. We called it an EAT because we thought, yeah, we can say it eats impediments. It also is responsible for the agile journey in the organization, the transformation, whatever you want to call that. It's 15 minutes. It mirrors the daily Scrum. It limits communication pathways. It increases communication saturation and operational awareness, cross-team coordination. And in this example, 125 people are involved with this process in about an hour versus with 300 pathways for communication instead of almost 200,000. I'm skipping a couple of slides to show you how this worked at some companies, but so the idea here, the different colors. So in a really big organization, the blue could be one of the products or an initiative in a portfolio. This could be, the green one could be another, the purple, the orange, and the yellow. Or these could be major features and components of a very large, complex product. and the EAT is sort of that highest order coordination, release, impediment removal, etc. More often than not, the EAT is associated with management structures and people who have signature authority, positional authority, technical authority, whatever it might be, and they're in a position to actually remove an organizational impediment. So that was quick, but we're going to get to see the same thing basically with different colors. And then maybe we can pause for one or two questions. So back to the Scrum at Scale framework, this time now we're going to look at the product owner cycle. So one thing to note is that the product owner thing called the meta Scrum, which we'll get into in a second, always has a paired scaled daily Scrum. And so let's jump into that. So here's our team. We all know there's a product owner, and then we have the rest of the team members. And the product owner sets priorities as a servant leader, spends half their time with the customer, half their time with the team. They're building backlogs, you know, epics and stories and sub-initiatives or themes or whatever you want to call those, focusing on the what. They're the known stable interface to the team. The product owner sets the backlog, which drives the work of the team. So the team only works on whatever's in the backlog, et cetera, et cetera. So just like we asked the question, well, how do we scale the Scrum Master accountability? If we have a bunch of Scrum teams sharing a backlog, how do we do that? How do we do that with a bunch of product owners? And so you might remember some of this from Henrik Nyberg's video, The Agile PO in a Nutshell. We have this thing called a chief product owner who he or she runs a meta Scrum. And this is the exact same thing for team level Scrum. It's not as structured. It's a combination of refinement and planning. So at this level, the chief product owner is refining and planning a big backlog. Let's say they're all really big epics. And the 5 Scrum teams here, those 5 product owners, they are constrained to create their backlog as a subset to the large shared backlog that is being maintained by the chief product owner. So again, cross-team coordination and alignment oversees the whole. So remember now, this is the product owner cycle. So this is focusing on the what, not the how. And this is all about backlog and prioritization. So in really big companies, you'll hear things like OKRs, you know, things like that. That tends to be another label equivalency to, well, what are we trying to get after at a high level? Let's create a backlog of initiatives or themes or sub-initiatives, depending on the tools you want to use. And then the individual product owners would take that and say, oh, you know what, my team, the way cool team, we'll take this really big epic and we'll decompose it and we'll work on that for the next few sprints. We'll get it done. And so again, just like on the Scrum Master side, we can get really large with this. I've worked with divisions or companies where there were hundreds of Scrum teams organized like this. And so in this example, we have a Scrum team that does its refinement periodically during the sprint and does sprint planning at the start of the sprint. And the product owners form a virtual Scrum team with a chief product owner, and they're looking at a shared backlog that these 5 Scrum teams will share. And then each of these sets of 5s, maybe they're just really cool features of a really big product. Well, there's a chief product owner that has a backlog probably at a more strategic initiative level that each of the chief product owners are going to claim a part of, just as each product owner claims a part of the chief product owner's backlog. And then, of course, just like the EAT, the executive action team, there's an executive meta Scrum. And so I've worked in companies, you can see the different color schemes. Maybe these are 5 entirely different products in a large portfolio, or maybe they're 5 super duper really big key features of a really large product. But the chief or the executive product owner, as I like to call it at this point, they usually are at an organizational level. They own a certain vision that's broad and covers a lot of the organization, depending on the size of the company. It could be a CEO. It could be a senior vice president. and so forth. And this is all about portfolio management at this level. Or as I like to say, big companies have portfolios of programs, products, and initiatives, and sometimes wholly owned companies if you're into mergers and acquisitions. So I've actually done this with a merger and acquisition. I've done this for companies that are quite large, and doing this now with the company I'm employed by. And so this is just a way to organize everybody around sort of that vision. Okay, is anybody completely lost? Is anybody here thinking they signed up for the Java conference? You know, is there sort of a fundamental question here? Is everybody okay? You can go off mute if you're like, what just happened?
Hello. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question, Giulio here. What about asymmetry of investment? So I was thinking that a big product, maybe you want to invest more on a feature area than on another feature area. So you will end up with a point where there are 20 teams in an area and 3 teams in another area because you are investing less in that feature.
Yes. Yes, there is no reason. This does not have to be symmetrical. It is most often asymmetrical. And in fact, it could be that the prioritization of the major components or features that you're trying to deliver are sequenced in priority. And maybe you only have 10 Scrum teams, so you work on the most important thing first, then you work on the second thing. Or as you said, maybe you put 7 over here, 2 over here, and 1 over there. So it does not have to be symmetrical.
I have a question also. You mentioned Conway's law and probably yes. Team topologies, etc. Based on your experience, which approach is better, to organize huge Scrum of Scrum, or to reduce dependencies and switch to the portfolio management with smaller Scrum of Scrum? So to reduce bureaucracy, etc.
Yeah, I think that is a different answer for companies. So generally speaking, what I like to do or what I recommend is have that executive meta scrum for a product, the blue widget. And Joanna's probably tired of hearing me say the blue widget because I say it all the time at work. So you have the blue widget, and if that blue widget has 3 or 4 cool things it's going to deliver, and you have a certain collection of Scrum teams working on it, then that's really the operational unit. And that's just one of a whole bunch of widgets in someone's larger portfolio. At that larger portfolio level, they probably, and they should, but they probably would have some notion of a high-level backlog with some key acceptance criteria that's going to delight the market or whatever it might be. But generally, that's where you have sort of strategy. And then at some point, it goes through a layer where they start to transform that into real tangible goals. And then somebody says, here's the thing we want to deliver to the market. That's probably the best place to start organizing the Scrum of Scrums. And the Scrum of Scrumma, Scrummy, Scrumma, Scrumma, Scrums, or whatever it is you need.
And in this case, in the third, etc. level, so Scrum of Scrum, you don't need daily synchronization, and it will be reduced.
Good question. Yes, the Scale daily Scrum is daily 15 minutes every day. I've done this where 1,000 Scrum teams are synchronized in an hour, and the last Scale daily Scrum takes place with the C-suite.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. That didn't happen in a day, which is what this slide is about. Okay, so it's really simple. It's a self-reinforcing architecture. It's linear, it's fractal, whatever. I mean, it's kind of easily understood conceptually. I know I went through it quickly because I want to spend time on the case study, but it doesn't mean it's easy to do. Easy to understand, not necessarily easy to do. Change is hard, right? Humans don't like change. And you need a senior leadership team that's engaged with this to support it. Otherwise, we get what I'm sure we've all heard of as the frozen middle, or the employees are doing Scrum and the leadership is still doing stoplight reports at the golf course, or whatever euphemism you want to use. So it's not hard to do. This is just part of change management in general. All right, so hopefully that is enough of an introduction, and I want to get to the case study to show you how this was put into practice, and maybe this will help understand the structure. So this is a case study where this is about identity and access management, so it's security, and it was done at a very large organization. It's been around for 150 years, multi-billion. It does federal, it does local, it does secret well, I don't want to say black ops, but secret stuff, for the government. It does medical research. It does all kinds of stuff, geographically distributed, academic in its leaning. They do a lot of research and stuff. Competitive leadership teams, not that we've ever seen this, sprinkled around a big company where they actually compete with each other and they forget they're working for the same company. And when there's always sort of central services and central governance, the different business units always look upon that as a tax. Why can't they just let us do our own thing? So this is a big company, been around for a long time. And so I come along and they're like, well, Steve, you're Mr. Agile. Can you help us do this way cool, really interesting, expensive thing in a more agile way? I'm like, okay. And so they said, we have to do this traditional project management stuff. So I'm going to assume there's at least one PMP in the room. You don't have to self-identify. But PMI is the Project Management Institute, brings us the PMBOK, the Project Management Body of Knowledge. And of course, they have the 5 phases of project management. At least they did when this project was in flight. And so they were following the book. They were following the rules. It's interesting how many humans want to be, just tell me what to do. Happy to do it. It'll be awesome. Just tell me what to do. And so we have PMI's 10 knowledge areas and process groups. That's right out of the PMBOK or version 8 or whatever it was at the time. And so they said, this is what we're going to do, Steve. And I said, but you just told me I was Mr. Agile. We don't do that this way. Well, we have to, it's government, it's, monies and federal monies and, okay, so, all right, I'll take you through it, meet them where it's going to be, and it's going to be awesome. And I said, well, all right, so let's start, let's follow the rule book from the PMI. No, we're special. I'm sure you've all heard this with regards to Agile. Let's do the daily Scrum. No, we're special. We can only do that twice a week. So it's like, we're special. And so I'm iterating on this because everybody thinks they're special. It doesn't matter if you're trying to go after Agile or traditional project management, or, a couple hundred years ago when they were introducing telephones and the business world thought that would ruin business, right? We're all special. We can't do cookie cutter, we're special. All right, fine. So we didn't just do 10, the standard 10 project management plans. The tradition in this organization was 16 of them. So we have the charter, right? Remember project charters and the scope statement and work breakdown structures and schedules and the communications management plan with the list of stakeholders and their preferred method for communication, and et cetera, and et cetera, and et cetera, right? I mean, if 10's good, why not 16? What are the underlying assumptions for this approach? Well, they're the same as they've always been in traditional project management. We actually know what the solution is. 89%, well, at least 65% of the time, that's not true. So you're all familiar, at least in the software world, 65% of all requirements change during the life of a project. So despite, I promised, Joanna, I'd behave. I won't go off on the Dunning-Kruger and all that sort of stuff. Despite years and years of evidence, we still think we know how to predict the future, and that we'll have all the time, money, and resources necessary. And of course, that second one is not true 89% of the time. The figures I'm giving you come from PMI, Pulse of the Profession, and the Standish Group, the Chaos Report. Okay, so they said, Steve, you have to do this. Great. So I knew how to do this. I'd done this before. Full disclosure, I used to be president of a PMI chapter in the United States. So I'm like, I know how to do this. And because I wasn't terribly happy about it, in every single one of these documents, remember now, this is a public set of documents because it's being done with public money. I put that sentence into each of the documents. If you read this, I will buy you a beer. During the life of this project, and indeed not once ever since this started, what was this, 10 years ago? No one's ever called me up looking for a beer. And not only that, but no one ever called me up chastising me for putting this sentence into any of these documents. What does that tell you? These documents weren't read. This is one of the largest expenditures for this organization during this year. And it was, do the documents exist? Check, 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 check. Well, everything must be great. And they didn't read them. This becomes extremely important when I give you the punchline of what happened during this project. So remember that. If you read this, I will buy you a beer. Okay. I have 20 minutes apparently. So we're just going to look at a few of the traditional management plans. This is the first one. This is the traditional, what's the project hierarchy? So where my mouse is, that was me. I had a project sponsor and who was a little higher in the organization. So once upon a time in this well, we'll skip the details. So that was me. I had this whole thing I was running. I had a governance board and I had a project sponsor. So when I was asked to take this and run with it, there were 6 business heads, 11 department heads, 17 managers. There was a governance board. We had each one of these color-coded areas had its own operating committee that was running the business. And the head count was in the hundreds, plus we had contractors. We had vendors that were helping us. Okay, that's pretty simple. Traditional projects, they always have an org chart. And usually the person who puts the org chart together is higher up in the org chart because it's like, you know, that. All right, so we did that, fine. And then I said, I got to get my hands around this. And I spent some time trying to figure out who was actually doing what, who could sign off on what, who had what budget, how communication took place. And lest you think I make this up, that's a photograph of a whiteboard where we spent significant periods of time actually writing it all down because nobody could answer the question. And so here's what it looks like. So we had the program core team, app specialists, infrastructure people, network people, security people, HR had to get involved, operations, different multiple IT business units from different parts of the business, the governance board, and so forth. And then you can see there's 2 sets of meetings, the ones in circles and the ones with colored dots, because it took like dozens of meetings for people to understand what was going on because it was all siloed and all that stuff that you would probably expect with traditional project management. The part of this I want to dig into, though, is the cost of this. So for the meetings in circles, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, $50,000 a month, US dollars. If we added them all up, so we had specialty meetings, we had platform, you know, the key KDMs, they used to call this, key decision makers. If we add all of that, $150,000 a month. Just to have meetings to talk about the work other people were doing. And of course, this does include the budget for Danish and coffee, right? Because that you can't have a meeting without Danish and coffee, right? So if you look over the projected life of this project, $5.5 million for people to get together to understand what was going on and to talk about the work other people were doing. So that's what you get with traditional, what's called Tayloristic approaches. So the other thing we'll look at is risk management. Of course, you have to have risk management escalation. This is part of the risk management plan with the risk register and the known unknowns and the unknown knowns and the unknown knowns, or whatever they call them these days. And so the green swim lane is what we needed to do if there was something that happened and we could keep it within this team. And then anything in blue was if it had to be escalated outside the team. This is pretty standard practice. You can see if it had to get to the sponsor, if it had to go above the sponsor to governance or the CIO or the CEO or whomever. Okay, well, great. But this is a beautiful case study in humans gaming a system. So for each impediment handled within the project team, so we're talking project team, which you could loosely think of as a scrum, scrummy scrums. It took about 3 weeks to actually do all the work we needed to do with the vendors to take care of an issue. If it went outside of the project team, it took 7 weeks. Now, think about this, write this down in your notes or whatever. The research says for every $1,000 spent on a project, there's one really important decision that has to be made. Doesn't matter the category, doesn't matter. If that decision takes more than 5 hours, the cost of the project tends to double. So think about this. Oh, we got a problem. 7 weeks later, it gets resolved. Not good. But wait, there's more. So none of this was included in any of the project schedule, which of course was done in Microsoft Project. I mean, how could you not? This approach loves Microsoft Project because it'll tell you in 2 years on a Thursday afternoon at 1:28 p.m., this puppy will be done. And we believe it. So 5 hours, if it took long, well, that's what I was just telling you. So people would follow the rules, formal processes, basically started to game. Some people were like, well, I don't want to make the wrong decision, and so I need to CYA. I won't define that here because it's being recorded. Traditional work intake processes, guaranteed to cost much more and much longer if we had to bring along the people that weren't familiar with the project. The cost of handling something within the project team was $4,000, a little over $4,000. And if it had to be escalated, it blew up to over $12,000. So a factor of 3. By the time I got involved with this and they said, Steve, can you run with this? They had already blown $300,000 on escalations. And that's not doing the work. That's just following the escalations. Now, why are these numbers so shocking? Because most of the time in this approach, people don't account for us. Let's say that, how many are there of us? 20. There are 20 on the call. Let's say we 20 are working together on the blue widget. Nobody thinks to capitalize or to account for our costs. We're just overhead. If we work on 1 project or 10 projects, right, the cost doesn't change. You just allocate those costs differently. So here I'm just measuring, well, how much time did everybody spend in meetings? What were they getting paid? Add it all up. So this isn't necessarily anything other than you can say definitively, well, here's $300,000 we could have spent somewhere else. Okay, but this is why it's even worse. So those higher in the org chart, whether there's an escalation or a status meeting or whatever, most of the time it starts out with, okay, well, let's have the status, what's going on? And in this case, well, we have an issue, we have a decision we have to make. And the people that are closest to the work tell the more senior people, well, here's the decision we think you should make and here's why. And they say, yeah, okay, good. And they rubber stamp it. And then the work carries on, which means this is complete waste. This happens because what we might say team members, product owners, Scrum Master, whatever it might be, are not empowered. It gets better. So like most traditional programs, there's a stage gate or phase gate, depending on what you want to call this. This was the first phase of 6 major phases. And this was the work necessary by about 40 people to put together the actual plan once the RFI, request for information, was answered by vendors. Then an RFP, request for proposal, was delivered. And then vendor selection took place. The entire team was put together, and somebody said, well, I guess we better figure out what it is we're going to build, for real. So you can see the timelines here. The KDMs, the key decision makers, were, that's supposed to be semi-transparent, but they're blocked out. There are real people's names there. And so phase one, with all the sub-processes and sub-gates and all that sort of stuff, meetings to satisfy milestones of the value stream map are not depicted. So this is really just a value stream or a flow of the work necessary to get to the phase two kickoff, where phase one was getting the project off the ground. 40 people. Did I mention it was 40 people? It's amazing, right? I'll give you what the real numbers were when we completely went agile in a minute. Okay, so there's over 40 people involved, and there was a lot of work. This was all documentation. Communication through documentation is known to be one of the least effective ways to communicate. But that's what this was all about. Okay. And so this is how the work was laid out. You can see the colored boxes grouping similar work that were presumed to be done by the teams involved, maybe at the same time. The numbers in the green circles show a time sequencing of dependencies. And then you can see there's flow charts and all kinds of pretty colors. And the timeline on the bottom is start of January 15th, or no, that's the years, January of 2015. Running through January 2016. So this is the work. The colors mean something, but let's just say there's two major phases to this. And then the second phase would take us all the way to April of 2017. This was all done in advance. The people doing the work had not yet been asked for their opinion. Right, so that's fairly traditional. So they gave it to the teams. This is really when I started getting involved, and we kind of went back and looked at all this, and they were like, teams like, yeah, we can do this. It's 28 additional months over what you thought. How could that be? Well, because you don't know how to do the work. And so we do. And so think about that. It's more than 2 years optimistic. All right. So development, integration, test, legal, regulatory compliance is LRC, if you didn't know that. And of course, again, Microsoft project, gave a date. Everybody just believed it. And so before it started, the project was already going to be years late. And if we go back to the meetings that we were holding on a regular cadence, an additional $3 million just to pay for the meetings. So we're pushing $9 million for just to have meetings, with really bad Danish, because you had to buy it from the food service on site. It wasn't the best Danish in the world. Not that I would know, but So you look at this, you say, wow, this is just extraordinary. Now, the reason for this is a very interesting psychological thing. The company's been around for a long time. They're used to doing work a certain way, and they could not get their heads out of the space of it all has to be done. It all has to have a pretty bow. It has to be complete, fully documented. Every possible switch, dial, and button has to work. And we're going to give this big bang delivery to the customer. And even when we started, agilifying or scrumifying or whatever you want to call that, it took them a while to realize that you didn't have to do everything all at once to deliver. So there you go. I mean, we're all Agilists, right? We're all friends here. We understand that. So what we ended up doing in the upper left is the picture I just showed. As we said, well, let's group out. Let's break out these things that are similar kinds of services. Remember, this is identity, access management. There's security stuff here. And let's start figuring out what makes sense to do together. If you're doing certain products like SSO or stuff like that, there's a lot of common work you can do in a bunch of products at the same time. It doesn't have to be do this one, now do the next, now do the next, because this is like a security infrastructure. So you can see these dashed lines here where we're saying, well, we can do some of this here, some of this here. This thing, well, it's easier to see here. These are two different categories of work in the same backlog in the same sprint. So it looks like two different things going on at once. But the work that was done in sprint 1, because of legal requirements, had to go into a sandbox where certain things were done and hackers were hired to try to get into them, and there were security things that we had to meet the government with. And so for each of these vertical columns where there's a blue box and a green box, it was the same team working on backlog. It's just that there were always specific stories in the backlog of that sprint to support legal and white hat hacking and whatever else is going on. And so we did this. There's a lot of work that went behind the scenes that I'm not going to bore you with because I want to leave time for questions. And we ended up with this. We presented this. I presented this to the oversight people and said, by the way, this is the approach we're taking because I'm the Agile guy, and here's the stuff we've already delivered. And they went, wait, what? You're already delivering? Because they thought it was going to be a couple of years. All right. So by the time we got here, we cut 17 months off the original plan, and we realized we didn't need the additional 28 months. This is just solely attributable to thinking about the work differently. Prioritizing, rank ordering, what are we going to do? How can we share, instead of repeating the same work over, how do we share work that are going to affect multiple things? And then green follows blue, LRC, basically. That's what I was explaining. All right. I might, Joanna's going to yell at me. I might run over 5 minutes here. But so what happened? In the middle of this, we suffered a terrorist attack. And a couple of bombs went off. This is, if you've ever read Taleb's book on anti-fragile, this is, I'm stealing his anti-fragile resiliency thing. So there was active terrorism. As a consequence, certain parts of the business went completely black. And when I mean that, like they were shut down, people showed up with earbobs, suits from the government, representing various government departments that had 3-letter abbreviations, many of which we'd never heard before. We had forensics teams on site. They were going through computer systems, et cetera, right? So it was not fun. And this was on the national news media. If I told you, I can't really tell you, but if I gave you a hint or two, I'm sure you saw the news footage on this when it happened. So disruption, which is a nice way of saying terrorist attack, disruption of the backlog. People are like, what's going to happen? And so the diagram you're looking at here is essentially, I'm just going to skip ahead here, is a depiction of what happened organically on the fly to respond to the terrorist attack. So this was not, let's sit down and come up with a way to plan for this and how we're going to recover and how we're going to prioritize and who's going to do what and what business is going to do that. I created this diagram on the fly, presented it to the oversight committee, and said, here's how we're handling it. It wasn't, now, if we were to say, let's stop and plan this out and figure out all the moving parts, this would have taken months. This happened over a period of 1 week. We just asked the people who were involved, what do we need to do? And I started drawing pictures, and people would come by, I forget the conference name. It was like every company or companies have a conference room for like operational crises, right? So this was the conference room. People would come in and I'm like, okay, we're going to do all this sort of stuff, which BUs, which is corporate, and how we're going to mitigate risk and how we're going to do all that sort of stuff. So before the terrorist attack, they were like, Steve, you got to present to the oversight group. This is one of the most expensive things. And I show up the first one. I'm like, I don't do stoplight reports. Let me explain Agile. And if you want to walk across the hall, we have this area set up called Area 51. You can go over and you can try things and you can lay your hands on keyboards. And, these are all the CIOs across this organization, as well as government. And so then, this happened. So I want you to think about this. This is demonstrative of, we know what's going on. We have situational awareness. We can tell you exactly what's happening. We have business agility. We know what the backlogs are. We know what parts of the backlogs are frozen now because of the government. We know what parts we can keep marching forward with. And they're like, okay, 3 times I presented, gave them the updates, and in the middle of this national, international news media and everything else, I get a memo saying, you know what, Steve? You don't have to show up and give us a status report. Just tell us when there's something really cool to see in Area 51. So, sorry, my dog's getting excited. My dog loves that story. So, all right, so this was really great. This was really great. All right. So what happened? We took this approach, which is command and control, Taylorism, Fordism, you know, command and control, whatever you want to call it, and we turned it into this. So this is Scrum at Scale. So what we have here are the different businesses with their various meetings. We have scaled daily scrums and meta scrums organized by Scrum of Scrums with various high levels of hierarchy. This is an inverted management pyramid where leadership was down at the bottom now saying, what can we do to help? As opposed to at the top saying, here's what we want you to do. And then those parts of the businesses that weren't doing any sort of Scrum, Kanban, Crystal, DSDN, whatever practices, XP, whatever, they had their own, they were organized as a Scrum of Scrums and they had their own scaled daily Scrum. Okay, so we went to a more agile way of let's deliver things early and often. Let's break up this large, big bang into smaller components that we can deliver. We reorganized how the organization organized itself around the work, and we ran it out of the corner of a hallway. So that yellow highlighted multi-page printout is actually Excel. That's how I ran the backlog. And then we had various graffiti and stuff. This is John's office. He was one of the technical leads. My office is around the corner. And then we had the timeout chair for people who came and bothered us. We'd make them sit in the chair in the corner. That's Brian. He's one of the key technical dudes. So you can see this is actually what we were printing out. It sort of looks like this. The stuff here, it's been blurred obviously, but the stuff in orange is stuff that was delayed and impacted by the the forensics people and all those people showing up. It eventually got done, but it was just, hey, oh, we can't do that. Oh, this business is off the grid. They're shut down. All right, well, that part of the backlog we won't do. We'll just do the rest of the backlog, and then when they're ready, they'll come back online. And yes, there were some dependencies. Yes, clearly there was impact. But the whole thing didn't stop. We just kept going. And even with that, we were able to deliver continuously throughout the life of the program, throughout the crisis response from the government and from the organization and so forth. And I don't normally like doing this, but because it's apples and oranges, but of the 50 plus products and services, that was the big bang thing, right? Instead of saying we need all this done all at once, we went to the teams at the 6 different business units, if you want to think of it that way, and the central team, and said, what are we ready to work on? Let's pull it, let's do it. And whatever the dependencies were managed accordingly. So value delivery, because we're Agilists, we talk about delivery of value, not the busyness, like not how many hours were logged, began to trickle out to the organization 3 years early. All value was delivered 1 year ahead of the Big Bang original schedule. So that was a year ahead of the schedule before we came along and said, yeah, 28 more months if you want to do it this way. 38 standing meetings were eliminated. They were not necessary. So that's a $5 million savings. We did the entire thing. Remember the initial org charts and everything? 36 people. There were 34 managers in the original incarnation of this. Various stakeholders were happy, and of course it was their idea, right? Because they're high in the food chain, and they're like, yes, it was my idea to tell Steve to do this. Well, in some cases it was, right? But and the various business heads were like so excited. They're like, well, let's get more people together to discuss our new approach, which was fine. Of course, there's an and then. And I'm sure, we Agile people have lived through this. Old habits. So, we had this cool new way of doing things, and then the traditional organizations started reasserting with change management boards and meetings and process and so forth. The CIOs of the oversight committee were like, we're going to do Gartner Quadrant 2. Gartner group came up with Quadrant 2. This is, 10 years ago, which was what they wanted to rebrand and own. It was Agile. Okay, so that was Gartner Quadrant 2 thinking. And there was changes going on, and around this time, the big boss of all the different parts of this organization decided to leave. The CIO in charge of all the CIOs decided to move on to greener pastures, et cetera, et cetera. Part of this, and a lot of people were like, this is great, but they couldn't keep doing it the way that they had been doing it because culture, right? Everybody was like, this was amazing, let's do more of it, but culture got in the way. And I think this is my last slide coming up. Yeah. Okay. What happened? So, I think that's supposed to be Napoleon, but anyway, I do not retreat. I attack in the opposite direction, right? So, optics is what happened. So this is a thing I've seen more than once. Credit, praise, congratulations, bonuses, or whatever are not heaped upon leadership anymore. It's pretty clear where the value is coming from. It's pretty clear that the people doing the work, or maybe business unit people, or what we might call product owners, or scrum of scrums, chief product owners, they were getting all the accolades and awards and blue ribbons. This is unusual and foreign to a traditional tayloristic company, right? Culture was simply not ready for it. It was based on command and control and compliance. And isn't it interesting how when they got into trouble, or there was a big project, and then of course there was a secondary crisis layered on top of it, they were happy to do whatever was necessary to take care of the problem. Then they reverted back to what they always knew. Leadership didn't actually understand what they were asking for by saying, let's do this Agile stuff. We got this guy, Steve, here. They were like, yeah, this is great. We don't need training. We're smart people. We're the bosses, right? So that's a form of Dunning-Kruger. You might want to look that one up. Dunning-Kruger is essentially people who are ignorant of their own ignorance. Ignorant of their own ignorance, sorry. And so in the end, after things settled down, after the wind got put into the notches of various leaders' belts, it was like, that was great. Let's go back to the way we always did it, because that's how the organization is built. That's how you get promoted. That's how you get your bonuses, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. 4 minutes past my time. Happy to take any questions for whatever you want. I can go back to some slides, but there you go. Hopefully that was a fun and interesting overview.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stephen. That was very interesting. So for anybody who can stay, Stephen offered, answer any questions. So please stay. And any questions, anybody?
I've just got one, Steve, just more on the executive action team in the Scrum Scale model. What I'm interested in when you try and set or implement that executive action team. So I'm kind of thinking there's a load of kind of traditional managers, project managers, program directors, all like lost sheep for trying to find a home. And I wonder, do those people move into the executive action team, or are they just cut? I think you answered it, sort of an example in your case study there. And if they do move into the executive action team, do they struggle in terms of the way they may have behaved or the way they've worked in the past?
So the answer is yes, all of the above. And so it depends on the company. The one reason, if we go back to the Scrum at Scale guide, where we say things like the Scrum of Scrum of Scrum of Scrummy Scrums with chief product owners, is, and without creating new labels, is in a traditional setup, like I was a program manager once. And so a program manager is probably a chief product owner, or maybe more likely a chief product owner. So you can slot people in to where it makes sense based on the values, skill set, and experiences and so forth. So there's no problem with that. It is true over time, you find that you need fewer people in the management layers because there's less need to report on the work of others. Now, I'm gonna, since you brought it up, great book to read is called Behemoth, and it's about how we came to the running companies the way we do in the 21st century. And it starts all the way back in the late 1800s with Taylorism. And so the reason for this is people were coming from the countryside into mechanized factories. And the managers would tell people, do this, don't do this, don't, if you do that, you'll lose a hand. If you don't do that, you'll get pulled into the combine, and that's the last we'll see of you, you know, whatever. And so that's some of the tradition behind the management, which is, I don't want to say micromanagement, but it's telling people do this, don't do that, and here's how you need to do it. So that goes away, and you need less of that because the team is supposed to be self-managing. So it is true you need less of that, which means typically there's fewer layers in management. But I've worked at a company where there was a vice president, and I don't mean like in this particular company, this was not a financial thing. So in a non-financial company, a vice president is much higher than like a VP at a bank. Banks have lots of VPs, for example. And so that person, I said, he was having a hard time. And I said, well, you know, what's cooking? He says, I only became a manager for the money. I hate what I do. You get that a lot. I was up the food chain and I'm like, you know what? This is terrible. I don't want to do this anymore. And so he said, I really like the Scrum Master kind of roles and accountabilities. And so it's like, well, you know, you could maybe be like the grand Uber Scrum Master. You could be a Scrum's Master. You could do whatever. But in this model, as we know in Scrum, the Scrum Master, it can be incredibly influential, a mover and a shaker, and get things done. And so the EAT is that kind of a thing. And it's where you have positional authority and so forth, the things I mentioned. But if you look at the top of this with the pretty colors, you know, and all the little boxes here, it's quite possible that you've gotten people that were promoted up in through the food chain that have very good operational skills, or in the Meta Scrum equivalent, they have very good product skills, or they have a good sense of the market. So you can slot them into different places. So some companies will do that. Some companies will inexplicably, I think they try to do this for cultural purposes. Okay, you know, there's 1,000 people in this company. You all just lost your job. You got to reapply. Here are the new jobs. Right. So, I mean, that's a popular move. And then people are trying to, you know, figure out where they belong. So there's lots of ways of doing it, but some people fall by the wayside. Two categories. They are invited to fall by the wayside, or they say, this is not for me. I got to find, you know, a company that's doing what I'm used to doing, and they self-select out. Does that cover it, Chris?
Yeah, no, it's interesting that there are some people would naturally slot into the roles, and I didn't consider that. So yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, thanks, Steve, for answering that.
Sure. Other questions?
Yeah, to you again. I have a question about how this impacts or relates to budgeting, HR policies, and so on.
Great question. HR usually struggles the most. I'll start with that. So for example, even though the Scrum Guide says these are roles, they're accountabilities, you're not supposed to make job functions out of them. Hang on just a second here. Gotta yell at the dogs. I'm convinced there's a squirrel out in the front yard that taunts them. So HR says, well, if we have this thing called a Scrum Master, don't we need a Scrum Master 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with a means of giving them more money and promoting them up through a Scrum Master hierarchy of job functions? It's like, well, no, it's a role. You can have whatever job title and perform the accountabilities of a Scrum Master. And this is how you get into some trouble with HR departments where they say, well, shouldn't a Scrum Master getting paid more, Scrum Master more than one team? And then they look to me and I say, well, why do you have a Scrum Master job function? Right? It's a role, like, they, like in titles, the company I work in, they have the title VP, Vice President. And then there's 40 different areas of competency that the Vice President goes after. And there isn't, you can become an Executive Vice President of Java debugging, like that doesn't exist. So there's challenges in the HR world for that. And budgeting is, we're working with a group right now. I've done some training with the finance departments. It's a shift away from thinking about the cost of being busy towards the cost of the value delivered. So traditional accounting practices, how many hours get attributed to this cost center, and how many people are billing against a certain client or whatever it is, and what's their hourly rate, and that's how they're used to covering expenses. And that's fine, but that becomes dead easy. The carrying cost of a Scrum team, say it's $1 million a year, fully loaded with benefits and, tax and whatever. And so you say, well, we need to do weekly cost accounting. Yeah, divide that by 52. Done. And then you try to push them to, now, do you have any idea what the return on investment is? Or are we still in the mode of, well, we take orders, we build stuff, and we deliver, and we have no idea what money we make with that. We don't know what the return on investment is. We just build stuff. So that's also a hard thing to start to overcome. It's causing people to think about, well, dare I say, more like a small business owner. Yeah, you have to keep control of your costs, your lighting, heating, electrical, whatever it is. But you also want to know if where you're investing your money is actually making you money. If it isn't, stop spending money there and go spend it somewhere else. Did that help? Let's see. I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce your name. Is it? How do you pronounce your name?
Julia.
Oh, it is Julia. I thought there was. Okay, good. Did that help, Julio?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Other questions of any sort, except the G7. I have no idea what's going on there.
Hi, Stephen. You mentioned that Scrum Master is just a role. So what do you do with Scrum Master in the companies that you work with? What else are they doing apart from being Scrum Master, that's just a role?
Well, all right, to be honest, I mean, I can tell you what I've done in a bunch of different companies, but I tend to try to give people an understanding. So for example, there are Scrum teams that the Scrum Master accountability rotates. Now, some people are like, wait a minute, that's Scrum heresy. But there's nothing in the Scrum guide that says you can't do that. Just like it says in the Scrum guide, I think it's page 8 now, I forget, where it says the product owner doesn't have to create backlog. They can delegate that, but they're still responsible for it, right? There's nothing in the Scrum guide that says a product owner and a Scrum Master can't be the same thing, even though when you go to the global Scrum gatherings and you put on the brown robe and everybody's drinking their punch and chanting the secret chants, everybody repeats that. And then somebody like me comes along and says, where'd you read that? And then you realize, no, this is just all, hearsay. So the intent, or the thing I go after, is to say, well, what's the intent of this? The Scrum Master accountability, make work visible, go after impediments, cause impediments to be removed, all that sort of stuff. And so companies would be like, well, we should have people full-time on that. And I said, yeah, absolutely. But once a Scrum team goes like hyper-productive, and once the organization has refactored, improved its value stream, has done all these things, you might have some Scrum Masters that maybe aren't as challenged, and maybe they could do other things. I had one Scrum team that did 1,850, I think it was 1,850% improvement in velocity over 18 months. They didn't have a Scrum Master, they did it themselves. So these are guidelines to say there are like gears in a watch that are meant to mesh together in a certain way to achieve a certain outcome. I mean, it's a methodology, right? Do all these things and the clock will keep good time. And if you don't do that, it doesn't mean it's not going to work. It just means you're suboptimized. So organizations want optimization. They want predictability. They actually don't want innovation. They want predictability. They want to, everything just works the way we set it up. And so they say, well, we must have a Scrum Master role or a Scrum Master job title and a product owner job title or squad leader or pack leader or whatever companies call them, because they think that it's a management job, but it isn't. So generally, when I get asked by HR leaders, and this has happened a few times where I've worked, it's happened at other companies, I say, well, at first they get very frustrated with me, but I say, I think first, before we talk about job titles, let's go after your management system and how you have objectives for individuals to achieve where they get individual bonuses. And let's instead go after how you incentivize a team. And then once we start having that conversation, it starts to dawn slowly that it's a team thing. So the roles on a team can be interchangeable. We talk about T-shaped people, we talk about all that good stuff. And then it makes it a little bit easier to have the conversation about, well, do you really need a Scrum Master job title in your pantheon of HR job titles? With pay scales and promotion paths and all that. And then companies go in very different directions. I don't know, Claudia, if that's helping or not.
Yeah, sure. Maybe just one follow-up question. Have you ever been a company that removed the role of Scrum Master completely after you coached them and they decided that we don't need that?
So when you say removed, like they volunteered to be removed, or somebody said you're not cutting it and we're going to remove you?
Both, probably.
Both. All right.
But the outcome was that there is no Scrum Master role.
Yes. The most recent example was actually not a Scrum Master, but a product owner that was voted off the island, if you will. There are some organizations where because humans are involved, right? And humans are humans. We all know that. It could be that you're not working well with a team, not because you're not good, but because I have to work with Chris Watson again. Are you kidding me? And he's like, Steve Daukas, that's it. I quit. I don't ever want to work with that guy, right? So it could be that the team is like, well, we need Chris. We don't need Steve as much. Let's vote him off the island. And there are organizations that say, that's fine. Then you go to a different place. If that happens 3 times, you're no longer employed. So again, different companies have different policies. And there are times where, in one example, this was a couple 3 years ago, a place up in New Hampshire where they didn't have a squad. They were following the terminology from Spotify, so they didn't really had squad leaders and Scrum Masters, and they were struggling with this, and they were trying to look at the Spotify model, which I did my very best to disabuse them of. And so there was a guy that was voluntold to be the Scrum Master. And then they said, if we decide to switch over to Kanban, can he be the Flow Master? And so, that's why coaches start to drink. And I said, there's no such thing as a Flow Master in Kanban. And so then we went through this whole educational process. And the guy was very good at being a Scrum Master. Like everybody recognized, wow, this guy is really good at this. But after a while, he said, okay, I think we got things going on an even keel. I don't really enjoy doing this, which surprised everybody because he was good at it. And so they said, you know what? So go back to what you were doing. Do you mind helping others, show them how you do certain things? And so that's where we got a subset of the team that thought they'd be interested in doing this job. And so then the rotation of the Scrum Master duties rotated around the subset of the team. And there were some really stellar developers on this team where like you kept them in the back room, right? So we'll leave it at that. And then when they went to Kanban, they realized it wasn't just a choice in Jira. Like it's a different thing. And so we had training on that. And so it was a kind of a large Scrum team. And it turned out that a smaller group, really, it did make sense for them to do Kanban. So we went off and set that up. So I tell you that story to say, so that's an example where somebody said, I'll do it. It worked really well. And then said, this is really not for me. I'd rather do this, but I wanted to, do it for the team. The team stepped up and said, okay, a bunch of us can help out. And that was the natural point to reevaluate how the team was working, to say, we are really two different operating units. And it makes sense more for one to be Kanban and for one to be Scrum. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, like I say, is, yeah, you're not cutting it. And so they got rid of them. How's that, Claudia?
Well, what I can say, you have a great impact in the company, so I would say. So yeah. Not sure what Chris.
There's so many. Right. There's so many war stories, By the way, I was picking on Chris because I just realized I actually know Chris.
Yeah,
tiny little people windows, right? I've spoken to Chris before. But yeah, there's all kinds of war stories, and I would say most of the difficulties come from more senior people not fully appreciating what they've gotten themselves into by saying, we're going to quote unquote do Agile, which, it's really Scrum or Kanban or something. And so that usually the education is usually a good thing to go after. Other questions, topics?
Okay, last chance to ask the question. Okay, going once, going twice, and going 3 times. Okay,
Look at that.
You prepared? Thank you very much, Stephen, for a lovely talk. It was very interesting. And thanks very much to everybody for attending. We will edit the recording, and Stephen kindly agreed to share it. So probably in a week or up to 2 weeks, you should get it in your inbox. Thanks very much, everybody.
So long. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Bye.